Hello, QueAnh. Thank you for joining us in our interview series. And let's make a short video of yours to our listeners. QueAnh Dang is assistant professor at Coventry University. She is an interdisciplinary researcher studying higher education and international development at the Center for Global Learning, Coventry University. Her research interests include globalization and doctoral education, sustainable development goals-related international research partnerships, the cultural political economy of higher education regionalism, soft power and knowledge diplomacy in Asia and Europe. She is currently leading the British Council-funded UK-SEA Partnerships and Exchanges Baseline Research Project, investigating higher education and research partnerships between the UK and 15 East Asian countries in the past decade. So, QueAnh, my first question is the following. In your research interests, among others, you have indicated internationalization of doctoral education, social imaginaries, and social mobility. Can you tell us more about these topics and why are they important?
Thank you, Georgie. I think internationalization of higher education on the whole is a well-researched field of study. However, doctoral education has its own feature, which are distinct from undergraduate education. So in most academic systems, doctoral education is regarded as both education and research. At its highest level of qualification, doctoral education requires different learning ecology and also aim at achieving different outcomes. In the current global context, I think global knowledge economy, the changing nature of knowledge production and research funding mechanism, labor market for doctoral degree holders are driving forces, and they are together led to different forms of doctoral education. Therefore, many types of doctoral education are underexplored, especially the international dimension and the aim and objective of those international dimension are under research. Doctoral education at university level is actually at the core of university activity and is also seen as an area of national, educational, industrial, and innovation policy. To prepare the doctoral education is not only to prepare next generation of scholars, but also to serve the knowledge economy. Therefore, the international activity in doctoral education also have different purposes, involve different stakeholders who has different imaginary at different level. And you can see that doctoral education is nowadays has been used by different international organizations like the OECD. OECD has used doctoral education as an indicator for benchmarking higher education system performance. So almost every year there is a survey of how many of the share of doctoral degree holders in different countries in the working age from 25 to 64. And then the OECD ranked the country performance according to the share of doctorate holder. On average, in OECD countries, about 1.1% of the population in the age range of 25 to 64 are holding doctorate degree. So what does it tell us? What is behind all of this benchmarking exercise? Where does student, where do the PhD student go for their degree, and where do they go for work after their degree? It seemed like those topics underexplored, and also the mobility of doctoral students certainly different from undergraduate students. For example, you could see in Switzerland, the UK or Luxembourg, the majority of doctoral students are international students. The potential of doctoral students in a cohort probably higher in many countries, in many developed countries. So it means that doctoral education in one system could influence other education system. For example, one country trained doctoral student who then return to work in their home country. To a certain extent, they carry the influence from the degrees that they received elsewhere. So therefore, I think the topic of of international doctoral education is interesting in the current debate. And of course, there are many underexplored areas in this context of international doctoral collaboration. By social mobility, I mean that there are a different type of mobility, not only physical mobility across geographical area, but also mobility between discipline. So doctoral research cross disciplinary boundary and cross linguistic boundary. I mean also the disciplinary linguistic boundary. You will see that a lot more doctoral projects involve researchers from different subject area, from different fields, to solve complex issues. You also see that mobility in doctoral education or doctoral graduate could involve vertical mobility, meaning that many PhD holders would be the first in their family, even in the developed country, the first in the family hold a doctorate degree. Their job, their career development would be different from the previous generation. So that it's about vertical mobility, but it could also be horizontal. They can change job, they can change their research area after doctoral study. So all of those movement or a different type of mobility also interesting to study.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Especially, well, can you explain also a little bit the social imaginary? You mentioned this social imaginary of doctoral education. Let's go inside this. What do you understand in this social imaginary of doctoral education?
Yeah, by social imaginary here, I mean the way that human being imagine how they fit in society, how they fit together, and at different level, different stakeholders have different imaginary. Often we look at different level, like in doctoral education at policy level, governments seek to address the national requirement for engaging in knowledge economy, for charting the way to develop the next generation of knowledge workers. For example, the European Union have the strategy to promote doctoral education and create a special funding scheme for it called Marie Curie, or at national level, government also have their own strategy to develop the next generation of scholar or knowledge worker for building their own knowledge economy, so that the different set of imaginary at institutional level, let's say university also have their own strategy to attract, to recruit students, domestic students as well as international students, to attract the talent, to increase their research profile, also their research output, and lifts their reputation. At individual levels, postgraduate researchers also seek to gain experience and also their future career prospect. They have their own set of imaginary of how they fit in their socio-economic context.
Yeah, clear. QueAnh, what do you think are the most pressing challenges with doctoral education programs which they face nowadays? I mean, challenges existing at all levels, faculty level and staff level, student level, or administrative level. What are these challenges, and are these challenges interconnected? And what do you think? And what are the mechanisms to overcome them? Because we are speaking about this, internationalization, more linking with programs, more similarity. So there might be some connections within these problems.
Yeah, I think your question had mainly focused on the internal life of university challenges. You're talking about administrator, you're talking about academics, but I think the challenge could come from from outside the university or within the university. So I mean, the list of challenges could be very long, and I only aim to give you a few challenges that I, as a researcher working in a university, and I'm facing those challenges on daily basis. For example,
that was the most interesting to hear about.
Yeah, the first thing is how to recruit the best student in the sense that they have the quality to conduct the research. They have the time, because time is a very important element in doctoral education. Nowadays, university are measured by how many PhD students they can educate and graduate within time. It means that they have very limited duration to conduct research. Sometimes doctoral education research have their own unknown area to explore, and sometimes the time limit also limits the innovation and the quality of the research. I would not say that we should have all the time in our life to do doctoral education or do doctoral research, but the pressure, the time pressure that both supervisors and students are under in most universities is to finish on time. Otherwise, the university performance will be affected. That give academics and PhD students in a position that they need to cope with pressure. Therefore, their mental health could be affected. So this leads to another issue of doctoral education, that mental health of both doctoral and supervisors are really a pressing issue in many countries. Of course, the next big thing could be seen as elephant in the room is the funding. To train a PhD candidate is a costly affair, and whether it's in social sciences or natural sciences, is still a very costly affair, from the lab material, from the people, number of people involved, from the cost for the research, but also the administrative costs like examination, field trips, and stipend for PhD candidate, the time of staff member, the time of examiners, and time of all the administrative staff, doctoral college training staff, developer, academic writing developer, all kind of other administrative support staff, from recruitment to graduation. I think it's if there are not enough funds, of course the quality will suffer.
From the student level, I've also in Georgia that PhD students have to publish a paper in peer-reviewed journal. And if we take into consideration that sometimes they have 3-year limit, it's kind of a very serious challenge, most of them, to publish a paper. It's a kind of requirement. Otherwise, they couldn't go to the defense level. How is it case in your university?
No, it's not the case in my university, and I would say that it's not the strict requirement in the UK. There are different PhD route. You could choose the route PhD by publication, but even that route in general, from my knowledge, you don't need to. The students are not required to get it published, but is the quality of the paper should be publishable. So there's a different level of requirement and different for challenge. As you know, that it takes time to get a paper published by a journal. It may take up to a year, so therefore it cannot be within the 3 years of the doctoral study. They need to conduct the research, and they need to in the UK, the majority of students write monograph in social sciences and humanity. In technology and engineering, there are different forms of thesis, but they need to write maybe a different length. For example, they have shorter thesis, but they will have more of the report and maybe video and other forms of artifact that show the quality and outcome of their research. But publishing is not, a published paper is not compulsory.
Georgian universities defend this, saying that they are ensuring quality by this, but actually I think this frequently creates a complication. Well, as regards publications, QueAnh, with our PhD students recently, we have read your papers, and I want to ask the following 2 questions about your papers. In your recent co-authored paper, which has a very interesting title, Curbing University Autonomy and Academic Freedom in the Name of Quality Assurance, Accountability and Internationalization in East Asia. You argue with your co-author that quality assurance might actually limit university autonomy and academic freedom. How is this process unfolding, and what might be done to hinder these negative developments?
Yeah. Thank you, but I mean, policy is a very fluid term. So it depends on the definition of quality and depend on the context of higher education system. In my papers, I'm actually explaining the process of quality assurance and procedure of quality assurance in a few countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, China, in that part of the world, where quality assurance could also mean monitoring and censoring academic activity. For example, in my paper, I wrote about class surprise observation in teaching. So that practice seemed to replicate the practice in school observation rather than as university. or in many universities in, say, China, the entire class are being recorded. So the space of teaching and learning is being surveillance. So that doesn't really show the improvement of quality, but it turned that quality assurance exercise into a kind of tool for control and surveillance of learning and teaching activity. For that reason, I argue that quality assurance can put a curve on university autonomy and academic freedom of individual. I also argue that in this paper that the university autonomy does not guarantee academic freedom of individual academic. For example, neoliberal university use their autonomy to impose different requirements on individual academic, like hiring or promotion, or contract, 0-hour contract with academic. So that kind of autonomy will not guarantee academic freedoms of individuals.
That's an interesting point, because sometimes, at least here in Georgia, it is assumed that institutional autonomy, increase in institutional autonomy also increases the individual autonomy. But as you point out, it might not be the case, quite the opposite, right? And my last question, QueAnh. In your research, you have also analyzed the issue of unintended negative outcomes of Bologna process. For us, it's very interesting for Georgia, because we also joined the Bologna process in 2005, I think. Yeah, 2005. Can you tell us what these unintended consequences are, and if there is a possibility to eliminate or at least mitigate them, which are related to this Bologna process?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to clarify the term unintended consequences are not always negative. So we don't need to mitigate. Sometimes we welcome unintended consequences. So
I paid attention to more negative aspects.
Yes, so, I mean, there are some negative unintended consequences, but not all of them are negative. So we need to distinguish between unintended consequences, could mean both. Yeah. For example, internationalization for most universities is an attempt to increase status, which could be seen as positive. But that kind of ambition or that kind of expectation from internationalization could also lead an institution to dependency relationship with other partner. So that could be seen as negative. Or another example of the adoption of English in most international program could also limit inbound student without the English proficiency. So it could be seen as negative. So in many parts of the world, like in my part of the world, for example, the student, of course, most international programs are offered in English, but there are increasing number of courses offered in the local language. Similar in Europe, you have people go to Spain to study a program in Spain, but because the period of mobility quite short, so maybe students would not have the language skill to make the most out of the academic study, but they tend to turn those months of mobility into language learning experience. But for, say, for example, many Southeast Asian students go to Japan or China or South Korea, and they study the entire program in the national language. That could also consider as another pathway for increasing international mobility. So I mean, the same activity could be seen as negative or positive, depending on which perspective you see it. But I think that the most harmful effect is to be oblivious to the possible negative consequences that result from international activity. Because if policymakers, researchers, leaders, and practitioners are not aware of the negative consequences, they would not have the plan to avoid them or turn them into positive activity, or turn them around. That just the important thing is to be aware of, and also to be clear in their planning what considered to be negative, to whom, and whether it's for the student benefits or for the institution benefits. So that they need to consider in their strategy. Sometimes, as you could imagine, that positive consequences for one could be negative consequence for others. Let's say the sending and hosting institution, they may not have the same perspective on the same activity.
Thank you. Thank you so much for answering my questions. And especially, I think this last one opens for Georgia higher education institutions an interesting field and space for discussion of so far from Bologna process, what kind of consequences we had and which kind of consequences were intended or unintended. And I think it's a separate topic of discussion, right? Thank you.
I just wanted to add a point that, for example, the Bologna process, of course, create a kind of architectures for European higher education system to be more compatible, to facilitate high-skilled worker mobility, facilitate friendship, also increase the sense of belonging, increase the sense of being European citizenship. However, the mobility or the mobility within the higher education areas, mainly from the newer members of the EU to the Western, or often cluster in a group of sub-regional area, and in fact is divide Europe rather than unite Europe. To a certain extent, you will see that cluster of Eastern European countries or Russian-speaking countries. You will see that or Mediterranean countries or Southern European country, often their mobility within a subgroup of countries, and Northern European countries, they try to use different measures to limit or minimize the one-way mobility that, for example, in certain countries like Denmark, they closed down English language program in order to reduce the number of other European students coming to Denmark, for example, and they only offer. So that is, I mean, for the taxpayer in Denmark, for example, that is a positive thing because they will not use their tax on somebody else. But it's a negative thing if the student cannot actually travel where they wish to travel, and it's not the intention of the Bologna designer, I guess, and not the intention of the policy makers at European level. So that could be, and another example is that in Europe or in many other parts of the world, internationalization, meaning that researchers are encouraged to engage in co-authorship with the international authors in order to raise their academic profile and their institution and status. But the unintended consequence could be that this kind of ambition may force researchers to study issues not really relevant to their country or to their own locality. So that could be an unintended consequence in the sense. Or sometimes mobility also facilitates brain drain, for example. So, but of course, that is very narrow understanding of brain drain, because now we don't talk about brain drain, but we talk about brain circulation, because the brain drain is very nationalistic view that the physical location of the person is drain out of their country, but it's not the way to understand it. But again, I said that internationalization, especially in the Bologna process, has many positive intended consequences, but there are negative unintended consequences. The main thing is to be aware of that and to devise the plan to turn it around, or to turn it into a positive experience. That what I would say in the paper. But of course, in the paper there are more interesting detail and the argument against and for in each context.
I'm sure that readers will find these details and enjoy and engage in this discussion. Well, thank you, QueAnh. Thank you so much for answering my questions, and I think they will be interesting also for a Georgian context specifically, and not only, of course, for this. So thank you, and hope to see you also again in the future.
Thank you very much.